Welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to look at how to use the mouse to be able to essentially pick and place objects in Unity in 2D and using Bolt. I've seen tutorials out there on doing this in 3D, but there are some pretty significant differences. In addition to that, we are also going to be generating a grid and being able to, when we drag these objects, snap them to different grid points. Additionally, right, we'll be able to move the camera, so if we want to pan up to further points in the grid and move our objects around, we can do that. This is kind of a purpose-built tutorial for a particular student, but it's I think it's a really great way to understand a bunch of different concepts in Unity and using Bolt. The tutorial consists of several parts. As you can see in the graph down here, if I zoom in a touch, one of the first steps we're going to take is we're going to generate a grid. We also then need to be able to pick up objects. You'll notice this is red, probably because I need to add a unit in there that essentially, only runs this if this thing is not null. But we're not there yet. And then, right, you've got to be able to pick the object up, drop it, but then also move it and have it snap to that grid. And so that's the majority of the code, and then there's also the code to move the camera, which is pretty basic, and it's things that have been covered in previous tutorials I've done, and many other people have done online as well. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and stop this, right? I've already got this all set up in a scene, and honestly, in order to reference it, I need these objects in here. So I am going to go ahead and shut these off real quick. Just so that the objects that, and this one is completely unneeded, so we can probably just delete that, so that we can create our scenes. Okay, so the first thing I would like you to do is to go into your hierarchy and create, go to 2D objects, sprites, and go ahead and do square, and make those squares, you hopefully have done this previously, but make those squares, make one, rename it red, copy it, rename it blue, copy it, rename it green, and I just have them kind of evenly set in the middle of the viewport. So you can do the same, and then each one of these, just make sure your scale is set to 1 in the X and the Y value, and then adjust your color so you can differentiate between them. And finally, go ahead and add a box collider to those. I mean, it may actually generate a box collider. We don't really need it, but it's good to have on there for the raycasting. Okay, that we're going to be doing. So the other thing we need to create, and it's something that I just knocked out there, but let's go ahead and create an empty. And this is going to hold basically our grid generation, picking up, dropping objects, etc. So we can just call it let's just call it mouse pickup, because that's exactly what we're doing. Okay, so we've got our mouse pickup object, and let's go ahead and add a flow machine to this. And I did this with an embed just because I wasn't sure if I was going to need to just directly access any of these objects. We could probably do it with a macro as well. I'm going to keep it as an embed because I know that works, and I'm just going to call it mouse. I'm just going to call it grid mouse pickup, something like that. It doesn't really matter. We're going to be doing a lot of different things. So the first thing we need to do is we need to generate this grid. And in order to generate the grid, we're going to do something that I covered in a previous tutorial, which is to use 2 for loops to generate a grid of objects spread out in space. And when we do that, we are going to want to have an object to use essentially as the dots or the points on this grid. So it's a visual representation, but we're also going to have colliders there so that we can use this circle overlap unit that we haven't talked about before in order to tell when our mouse and the object we're carrying is within a certain range of that, so then our object will snap to that position. Let's go ahead, and I've got this object here called grid dot, but I'm just going to go ahead and recreate this. So I'm going to go down to 2D object, sprites, circle. And I don't want it to be that large. I'm going to set the scale of this circle to 0.25 in all 3 dimensions. Okay, I'm going to leave it white. And I'm going to go ahead and set the X and Y position to 0, which should hide it, right? It's going to be basically behind this blue square right here. So I've hidden that away. And what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to rename this. I'm just going to call this, I'll just call it dot now because I already have grid dot and that's just less characters to type. So I'm going to call it dot. I'm going to select it. And the other thing I need to add to this object is a physics 2D. And I could do a circle collider or a box collider. It doesn't really matter. Box colliders take less effort for Unity to work with. And, it doesn't really matter if we're, within a square point or whatever. If I click on this and zoom in here, right, you'll see that that's basically where this thing is set up. And we're just going to leave it set as a collider at this point. I don't think it really matters. No, let's go ahead and make it a trigger. This is so that when we're dragging these things over, if their collider hits there, it doesn't cause some sort of weird error, which would be kind of comical. So I'm going to make it a trigger. It's dot. Now, the other thing that I need to do is I'm going to need to create a new layer and have this be this layer. So I'm going to click Add Layer. And I've already got mine in here, but just go ahead and type in grid. And once you've done that, go back to your dot object and make sure you come down to layer and you select grid. Now what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to essentially mask off every other object in here so that we know that these are grid-based objects, and that's all we're going to be looking for when we're doing the circle overlap with the circle overlap unit. Okay, so we've got that set up. So let's go ahead and then we need to make this a prefab because we're going to be instantiating it all over the place. So let's go to our project, go to your prefabs folder. If you do not have one, just go ahead and create a new folder and name it prefabs. And then we're just going to go ahead and drag this dot down in here. And I might actually open my prefab real quick and recolor this to purple. That is intense. Maybe I'll make it a little bit less intense. Right, just because I already have one that's white and I want to make sure that I am not unintentionally causing myself a lot of headaches. Now, I'm not going to need this in my hierarchy as it is because we're only going to be instantiating it, and I don't want to accidentally click on this, make some changes, and have it not be applied to the prefab. So, because I seem to always do that and forget to adjust it. So I'm going to delete this. Okay, so I've got everything set up to make my grid. So what we need to do is, the first thing we're going to need is, we're definitely going to need a for loop. So I'm just going to go straight from my start event and type in for, because right, we only want to do this once at the beginning of when everything loads is when we want this grid to generate. Now we could set up code that we could, have other things trigger it to regenerate a grid or adjust the scale or whatever, but for now we're keeping it simple. So we have these 3 values that we're going to need to be setting, right? So the first, the last, and the step. And we're going to be using the step as a means of essentially spacing the different grid points, right? So instead of we're going to start with a step of 1, but then we can set it to 2, 3, 4, or whatever. So what we need to do is we need to create some object variables to allow us to adjust these values without having to come in here and do it manually in this place. So the first one I'm going to create is just called step size. Right, and step size, this is going to be an int. We want all of these to be integers, in fact. I'm going to set step size to 1, so it's still at the default to begin with. I'm going to go ahead and pull this in, and I'm going to connect it to the step. Now, the next thing that I need to do, and we'll be adding a couple units in here later because we're going to want to do offsets. Right now, it's just set to 0 to 10. And so it's going to start in the middle and kind of go up and left and right, which isn't exactly what we want, but it'll be fine. So we want to create a variable just called grid size. And with this grid size variable, I am going to go ahead and make that an int as well. And right by default, 10 is this loop will loop 10 times. That's what the 0 to 10 means. And so I'm just going to leave it again at the default. But this is all meant so that later I can make this grid substantially larger if I need to. So I'm going to go ahead and connect this to last. And I don't need anything set in first yet. Eventually what we're going to do is we're going to basically divide this value by 2 and subtract the result of that from 0 to get the first value and subtract it from the full value to get the last value, more or less. And that way we'll offset it from, say, if it's 10 values, it could be -5 to 5 instead of 0 to 10. Okay, so we've got that set. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and we're going to go from the body. What we want to do is we want this to count through 10 times. And if we just did instantiate over here, we would get a line of 10 values, either vertically or horizontally, depending on if we ended up putting the index value in the step, or sorry, in the X or Y direction. But what we want is we want rows and columns. So I'm going to go ahead and copy my for loop. I'm going to bring it over here, and I'm going to run the body into the input here, which means that each time this goes through one step, it's going to go through however many, like 10 steps here, and then it's going to pop back out, go through, do another 10 steps, right? So I'm going to draw 10 circles, 10 circles, 10 circles, 10 circles, etc. Okay, so in the other thing I need to do is I want my grid size to be controlling this value as well, and I want my step size to be the same. Now, I could potentially have independent variables that control the step sizes of the rows and columns, but we want this to be uniform, so we're going to keep it the way it is. And then in the body of this one, all we are going to do is we're going to do two things. First, let's go ahead and create an instantiate unit. So I'm going to say game object.instantiate, and I'm going to say original, position, and rotation. And so for the original, I have this prefab, so I can click here, and my assets, I can just type in DOT. I can select that. That's the object that I want to instantiate. For rotation, I'm going to click on the dot, I'm going to click again, and I'm going to type in quaternion.identity, which basically just gives you the default rotation value, and you don't need to worry about much of anything else with it. Now, position is the last thing that we need to figure out. So I'm going to go ahead and say add unit, and I want to create a new vector 3, and I could probably do the new vector 3 xy, but who cares, xyz. It doesn't really make any difference. So I've got this new vector 3, and what I need to do is, in order to do these, I need to pull the index values from both of these loops and have one of them go to the x and one of them go to the y. Because this is all drawing right at the start and it's only once, we're not really going to see them draw in time across the page. It doesn't matter which is which. I'm just going to go ahead and connect this over here. That would be the x, and this will be the y. Once I've got those connected, I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, let's go ahead and do, right? So we want that to go live. We want this to go live. And then we're going to want to make sure we connect our position. So with those things set and making sure Z is still set to 0, I should be good to go, and I should be able to draw a grid. So let's go ahead and see if we can actually get a grid to show up. Okay, look at that. We have a purple grid that is spaced at 1 unit. You can see on the grid lines in my viewport, in my scene. Oops, that is not what I wanted to do. Let's click off of that. What I wanted to do was drag this. There we go, right? And you can see that, right, it starts at 0, 0, and it basically builds up and over, right? And so you can understand, like, oh yeah, we will need to offset this grid at some point. Now, there's a couple ways we could do it. Honestly, we could do it here, or by having these values here, or this could be the child, right? This grid could be a child of another object, and that object could be offset. And so it's really up to you. That would probably be, honestly, a little bit easier in terms of number of units, but you know, I don't know if there's any advantage to doing it one way or the other. Okay, so we've got it set to 1 to 1. Let's go ahead and do a test. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this, and I'm going to go to my object pane of my variables, which if I select my mouse pickup object, right, I can also access those same variables here. I'm going to increase my step size to 2, and I'm going to increase my grid size to 20. And I'm going to go ahead and run this again. Now, this should give me the same number of dots, but they should be spread out, right, twice as large, right? If I did 3 and 30, they'd be, right, 3 and 30. Or they'd be, right, I'd still have 100 dots, right? 10 by 10 is 100. So I'd still have 100 points on my grid. They'd just be more spread out. All right, so this allows me to adjust that scale. You know, one of the things that we can't do right now, and we would need to, if we wanted the scale to be smaller, what we would need to do is we'd need to be multiplying the indexes, you know, by some value. We'd probably set the step size to 1, and then have the index size, values get multiplied by, say, 0.25 or 0.5 or whatever to make it smaller than that. But that's not something, you know, we're necessarily interested in doing right now. So we've got this grid set up. Fantastic. This is the first part of the tutorial. And when I come back, we will continue on with the interactive pieces that we need to do. Okay, so in the previous section, we created a grid of purple dots that we are going to now start writing some code so that we are creating a graph in order to be able to use our mouse position on the screen to hover over these, select them, click and drag them, and then have them snap to different positions. But before we have them snap to any positions, let's go ahead and work on the selecting code. And we're going to do this in our mouse pickup object again. Make sure you click Edit Graph so we are in the right graph. And I'm going to go ahead and double click. And step 1 is just going to be to spread things out. We're going to be using the update function to do this. And I just want to make this a little bit more clean. And before we get going any further, I might pull that over there. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and encapsulate this in a group by holding down Command or Control and clicking and dragging. And I'm going to call this group Generate Grid. All right, so let's get this housekeeping taken care of. And I'm going to change this color to something like exciting, like green. Okay, so we've got our Generate Grid. And now what we need to do is we need to start looking at how to basically hover over or, you know, click on objects and pick them up. So the first thing we're going to do is, rather than do a hover, because generally, right, usually, at least in our use case, we're not going to be hovering over these things. We want to be able to click and make a selection. So I'm going to go ahead, and the first thing I want to do is, raycasting is expensive computationally. So we only want to do it when we absolutely have to. And so we're only going to execute a raycast if a button has been pressed. And in this case, it's going to be the left mouse button. So I'm going to go ahead and click over here, and I'm going to say input.get mouse button down. And button 0 is the left mouse button, so we're going to leave that alone. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to come over here with our Boolean output, and we are going to create a branch and connect our flow here. And then the only time we're going to do anything is if this is true. And if this is true, we're going to want to do a raycast. And very specifically, what we want to do is we want to grab we want to be doing this from the position of the camera and from the screen point, right? Like where we are in the XY plane on the screen with our mouse, and translate that into our world. And so fortunately, there is a unit that does that exact thing. And now I just have to remember what it is. I think if we just say, I think it's Camera.ScreenPointToRay. There we go. And the one we want is, we just want the one that's just the position. The eye basically, yeah, we don't need to worry about. So we're just going to do Camera.ScreenPointToRay. Okay. So the camera that we're going to be choosing is not our current camera, but it is our main camera. And there's a couple ways we can reference that. Because this is an embed, I could go in and select the main camera this way. But we can also click over here, and we can come down and we can say, we can just type in main and camera main.get, or it's camera.main.get. Now, what this unit does is it gets whatever our main camera is. However, what we need to do is we need to make sure, and I'm going to double click to step out of this view a bit. If I select my main camera, the only way that that unit is going to select it is if its tag is set to main camera. And because this is just the default camera that came in the scene, it is tagged that way. But you just want to make sure you tag your camera as main camera, and then you can work with this. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop. Oops, wrong graph. Let's go ahead and go back to mouse pickup. There we go. Double click, pull in here. Okay. So we've got our update event. We've got input get button down. If that's true, we are going to generate an array. So what we need here is we're going to need to get our mouse position. So if we just type in mouse.position, there's this input mouse position get. That's what we want to use. So we are going to say, right, the position we're going to be getting is our mouse position, and that's a screen point, right, to array. And so now what we need to do is this little line here is an indication of array. An array has several different things. If we just click here and click over here and just say ray and click expose ray, right, you'll see that there are just really two options. There's the origin and there's the direction. And what we need to do is we're going to need to use both of those items in order to do this next step. And so go ahead and create this expose ray. Now we could, there's also, if we just needed the origin or we just needed the direction, then we would, we could click over here and click, and right, we can actually get or set the direction, get or set the origin, and then there's, you know, there's like this, you know, we can get a point too, but that's not really what we're looking for, right? But so really we just need our origin and direction. So we've exposed the ray. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to do the raycast. So I'm going to have my flow come over here, and I'm just going to type in, and this is 2D, so I'm going to, so I'm going to say physics 2D, which should be fun. .r, and if I just do .r, that's enough to get me to the raycasts. And so now there is one that's origin, direction, distance, origin, direction, distance, and layer mask. This is the one that we are going to want, which is the one that has the layer mask. And we haven't created a layer mask yet, but we're about to do that. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and click on this. And then let's go ahead and connect our origin here, our direction here, oops, And for the distance, I can't remember what I set that to previously. Obviously 0 probably doesn't work. I think we could probably get away with a distance of 10. Now, and maybe what we should do is just do a distance of 50, right? Because that'll shoot it through anything we have. If it's coming from the camera or the screen, technically that's 10 units in the Z direction above all the action that's happening. So 50 is plenty distance to be able to select things. And now we need to make a layer mask. So let's go ahead and double click to get out of that, and we need to create a new layer that is going to make sure that we isolate only the objects that we want to be able to pick up. So in this case, it'll be these 3 objects. So I'm going to go ahead and select red, green, and blue, and I'm going to go to my layer, and I've already got this pickable layer, but right, if you click add layer, and then you were to add, say, pickable in one of these fields, it doesn't matter what layer it is. And then go back and select these 3 again. Once you've created that, then you can go ahead and change this to pickable. Okay, so that's going to be what we're masking for. And so let's go ahead and double click. And if I click on layer mask here and click again and type in layer mask, and then I think I can just say space lit, and yeah, layer mask literal. And then with this layer mask literal, right now it's set to nothing, but if I click on this, I can go down and choose pickable. All right, and the way that layer masks work in Unity is really you're supposed to be essentially masking out all the layers that you don't want to have this picked up. But with this, what's nice about this is you basically say, this is the layer I want, and it automatically does the things to set the value to the correct value to mask everything else. Okay. So we've got our Raycast going. Fantastic. So now what we need, now what we need to do is we need to get our hit information, and we need to translate that into some sort of action. And the action that we want to take is we want to get our Raycast hit. So let's go ahead and do that. Raycast hit 2D, and we want to grab the collider that it's hitting. Now, once we've got that information, what we want is we're going to be wanting to get the game object that is, right, that has this particular collider on it. So I'm going to go ahead and click, and I'm just going to say game object.game object, and I just want to say get, right? And so it'll come in here, it'll take this collider, it'll figure out what that game object is, and it will give it to us. Now, what we want to do with this information is really, at this point, we want to store this in a variable. We want to basically take this unit and we want to store it. And so we're going to create a scene level variable in order to hold that unit. So I've already got this grid list that we're probably not going to use in this tutorial, but we might use it soon. But what I want to do is I want to create a variable called picked object. I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to change this type. I mean, I could leave it at null, but I'm just going to set it to game object. Right now it has no game object in it, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hold down Option or Alt if you're in Windows, click and, oops. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt, click and drag, there we go. And release, so I have my set variable. And, you know, eventually what I want to do is, right, I want this game object to be in here. Now, there's some problems with what we've got going on here. If this ray does not hit a collider, this is going to be null. And if this is null, then this is going to be null or potentially broken. And we're going to have some problems here. So let's go ahead and do a null check real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this up here. I'm going to type in null check. And if it's not null, this is what we want to do. So if this is not null, we want to set our picked object in the variable. So let's go ahead and just see if this works as it stands right now. Double click. And all it's going to do is when we click on these, we're not going to be able to move them or anything, but when we click on these, we will be able to go to our scene variables and see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And it's going to take a bit because it generates that grid. Okay, so the grid is generated. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go to my scene variables. And right now my picked object is null. But if I come over here and I click on this, you'll see that as soon as I clicked there, now it's grabbed that red object. If I click here, it's grabbed that blue object. If I click on one of these dots, it shouldn't do anything because, right, it's that layer has been masked out. And if I click on green, that should also change, right? So green, red, and blue. And you'll note that when I don't have my finger on the mouse button at all, right now it is still set to whatever I last selected, right? So that's something to be aware of. What we're going to do next, now that that is functional, and obviously if it wasn't functional, go through this graph again and just make sure, I'll put the whole thing in the frame here, make sure that you get that set up. Okay, so what we need to do next is we need to essentially check when this mouse button is, when we lift up on this mouse button, and when that happens, we want to essentially set this to null, right? We don't want to have a variable in there at all once we've let off the mouse button. And remember, this is like a pulse, right? It's when you click down that this sets. It does not continue to remain true while you're holding down on the mouse button, right? It only happens for a little bit. Now, one of the things that we're going to need to do, and we haven't really talked about this before, but if we have multiple update events like this, there's no telling what order those are going to go in. There's always a chance that there's some problem with how that gets executed. And so what we need to do is, in order to make sure that this get mouse button up section only happens at the end of a frame, what we want to do is we want to right click and we want to type in late. And we want to use the late update. What late update does is it basically says this is the absolute last thing that's going to happen, every frame. So we're not going to have a situation where really like buggy things can happen because it's sometimes, listening, sometimes it gets a mouse up, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so let's go ahead and say input.get mouse button up, and again we want to use mouse button 0, and we're going to do basically the same thing here. We're just going to, we can copy this branch, pull it down here, connect this here, right? And so if the mouse button goes up, all we really want to do is we want to take our scene variable, I'm going to copy and paste this, and we're going to want to set this to null. So I'm just going to go ahead and click over here and I'm going to type in null and add a null unit. And that is it. So now if I go ahead and run this, and this is running, I go to my scene variables and I click in the window and then click on an object and leave the mouse button down, you'll see it says red. As soon as I lift the mouse button up, it goes back to none. So I click and I'm holding down and it's blue. I lift up and it's none. Holding down and it's blue, right? And now it's none. Okay, so now we've got the start and the end of our events done. And now what we need to do is the middle part. What happens while the mouse button is still held down? And right, we're moving these objects around the screen. So real quick, let's go ahead and group these two sections. So I'm going to hold down Option or Alt, Command or Control. I'm going to create a group around this, and I'm going to call this group, let's see here, pick up object. And I'm going to select this, and I'm going to go ahead and let's just go ahead and make this a beautiful pale blue. And then this final one down here, which is nice and small, we're just going to call, we'll just call it drop object. And let's go ahead and make that red. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to carry our object. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to select this. There we go. Okay. So now we need to do our carry. So let's go ahead and use another update function. I'm going to copy and paste this. And Now, this is happening the entire time. And so the question is, what do we need to do to carry this object? Well, the first thing is, right, that what's nice is there's this ray that's getting generated here, right? And there's an origin and there's a direction, right? What we really want is we want the origin to set the position of this object up here that we're saving as a variable. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to scoot this over for a bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to my scene level variables. I'm going to grab the picked object variable, maybe. I'm going to grab the picked object variable. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can actually see the text on here. And then what I want to do is I'm going to want to go ahead and say transform.position and set. And I'm going to go ahead and just drag from here, from the origin, down into this position. And let's just go ahead and do this little bit here, and let's see what this warning is. It says target cannot be null. Okay, so basically let's make sure that this is not null, right? We're gonna have to do this null check, or else it's gonna get grumpy with us. So let's go ahead and right click and say add unit and just say null check. We'll put our null check in here. We're gonna go ahead and connect this to here. We're gonna say if this is not null, and then we will connect this here. Now, it's still giving us this warning, but it's never going to be null, right? Because this flow is not going to happen unless it is not null. So we've protected ourselves against that. Okay, so let's go ahead and just see if we can actually move this thing around with this little tiny bit of code here. So if I click here, oh, look at that. Now I can drag this object around the scene, and I can let go. I can click on the blue object, I can drag this object around the scene, I can click on the green object, and I can drag this object around the scene as well. Right now they're just free form being moved, but we now have the ability to drag and drop an object on anywhere on the scene. So if that's all you're looking for, you could be done with the tutorial at this point. But if you're interested in how we can then get this essentially to these set units to snap to a place on a grid, that's what the next steps are for. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop this. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we need to kind of talk about how we're going to do this. And it would be really great if, as we're moving the mouse around, we actually have some sort of visual representation in our scene that's going to allow us to see kind of where the boundaries of what we're going to be creating are. So the first thing is we're going to be using a new unit called overlap circle. And so if I right click and I type in physics 2d.over, there's overlap box, overlap area, overlap point. But very specifically, we want to overlap circle. And we're going to use this one that, here we go, there it is, the one that just has point, radius, and layer mask. So we're going to go ahead and select this guy, right? And so what this is going to do is it basically is going to be creating a circle around the pointer of the mouse that will be set to whatever radius this is. And we're going to be using that as a way to determine what collider we're closest to or we're overlapping. And if we overlap with a collider, we are going to snap to the position of that collider, right? So, right, because if we have these at 1 unit or 2 or 5 or 10 or whatever, right, what we want to do is we want to have this circle essentially be big enough so that when we are, basically halfway or a little over halfway between, if we're on one side of the halfway mark between two colliders, right, we want to be touching one and not touching the other. And the one we're touching, we want to snap to, because that's essentially the direction we're moving. And, maybe it's not going to be exactly perfect, but it in my experience with preparing for this, it worked pretty well. So we have some questions that we need to answer. First, like, what point are we using? And second, what's the radius going to be? And then, what layer mask are we going to be looking for. And the layer mask is going to be, right, we want to type in like layer, wow, I spelled that wrong already, layer mask space lit, so we want to have a literal there. The radius, what we want to do is, we're going to need to determine that. But first, let's go ahead and adjust our grid settings a little bit, and then we're going to create a gizmo so we can actually see the radius and make some choices about things. So if I go to the object value here, I'm going to go ahead and set the grid size to, or the step size to 2, and the grid size to 20. And so now I've got those two set. If you already had that set from the previous tutorial, fantastic. If not, just go ahead and change it now. And then I just want to go ahead and do one other step, and that is going to be to create the gizmos. So I want to say on draw gizmos is the event that I want to use, and the gizmo that I want to draw is, I just want to say draw, I think it's draw wire, and we can say draw wire sphere, right? There's no wire circle as far as I can tell, but a sphere will work fine. Okay, so we want to know what this, so now we need to know what the radius is going to be. And what I would like to do is let's go ahead and start out with using our step size as the radius. Now, I know already that this is going to be too big, but it's a good place to start, and we're going to be using this variable no matter what in the end object, right? Because we want to be able to have this circle size change with the size of the grid. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the step size down in here. There we go. So I've got my get object variable step size, and I'm just going to connect this directly to the radius. And I'm also going to connect it directly to the radius of the draw gizmo. Now, with that set, the next time this draw gizmo pops up, right, you can see that my center is currently 0, 0, 0 on there, and that is basically the exact same thing as this physics 2D overlap circle, right? So this is where that overlap circle is currently rendering and the size it should be, right? So if I go ahead and, granted, I don't have anything attached here, but what I want to do is I want the center of this, right, sphere to be my mouse position. So I'm just going to go ahead and say mouse dot position, which, there we go, input mouse position. Okay, so let's go ahead and just see how this works as it currently stands. Obviously, we're not going to be doing the overlap circle, but I just want to make sure the gizmo is set up in a way that is visible. Now, you'll note, right, I'm getting true values in here, but you'll also note that, right, this is over my entire screen, and I'm not seeing anything here. And that's because, right, the mouse position does not correlate to the world unless we do the ScreenPointToRay option. Now, fortunately, we've already done that up above. So let's go ahead and stop this. And, right, so mouse position isn't going to help us out any. So let's go ahead and delete that. But what we need to do is we need to come up here, and we need to go ahead and just grab our origin again and drag it down here and set that as our center. Surprisingly enough, that's also probably what we're going to want to use for our point that we're doing this overlap around as well. But let's go ahead and see if this works a little bit better. Okay, there we go. Right, so now as I'm moving this around, you can see that that thing is overlapping. Now here's one of our problems, right? If I hover over one of these points, you can see that my overlap is actually hitting 4, and now if I was to come up here, it's hitting 5 colliders. We don't want that to happen, right? And if our spacing here is 2, really we want our radius to be 1, right? We want it to be half of that. So let's go ahead and adjust our radius so that we aren't going to have some weird, crazy behavior as we move this thing around our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and open this. I'm going to zoom in, and right, I've got my step size here. What I need to do is I need to just create an add unit. I just need to add a unit, type in div for divide, and it'll think really hard. And then I want to do math scalar, and I want the b value to be 2 because I'm going to be dividing this in half. And I'm never going to change that. So it's fine for it just to be a static value there. So I'm going to connect that in there. And then I'm going to connect the output of this into the radius of my circle overlap and into the radius of my draw gizmo. And if I go ahead and clean this up just a touch, let's go ahead and set that up. Okay. Right. So now I've got these things set. So let's go ahead and double click, and I just want to make sure that my gizmo has updated to the correct size. So I'm going to play this one more time, and then we will go ahead and do the overlap. Okay, so here I am on screen. My gizmo is much smaller, and you can see as I move around, right, really I'm only going to be able to cover one collider at a time, which is exactly what we want to have happen. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop this. Now, something to note, right, if I end up choosing like a step size of 3 or something like that, it is, because this is all integer math, I'm not sure exactly how big this gizmo would draw, or if this overlap circle is going to draw the same as well, but it shouldn't cause an error. It'll just be, not perfectly half, which should be fine. Okay, let's go ahead and stop this. Currently, what we've been doing is we've been transforming our position just solely based solely on where our ray is currently at, right? And that's not what we want to do. We actually want to make a few changes to this. So first, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select all of these units. I'm going to drag them over to this side of the graph because we're going to need them over here in order to choose the object that we're going to be doing the transform to. And we're going to need to, let's go ahead and activate this this overlap here, which actually we don't need to do that yet. We might need to adjust where our update is. So let's go ahead and actually let's disconnect this, because I know this physics 2D overlap needs to be have the flow run through it. It can't be drawn from. So then once we do that, let's go ahead and come over here. And we're going to be doing 2 null checks, actually. We're going to be basically saying, is this picked object null? Because if it's null, we don't want to do anything. But also, what we're getting out of here is our collider, right? So we're going to do basically what we did up above, where we're just going to say GameObject.GameObject. Oh, this is the third one there. Okay. So GameObject.GameObjectGet. Again, we want to do a null check, so I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this. And I'm going to bring this in here. And then, we just need to adjust our graph a bit so that we can do both of these null checks. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this line. I'm going to connect here. And then basically, if our collider, is not null, then we can go ahead and check and make sure that our picked object is not null, which, probably we only really need one of these, but we should just make sure both of those are not null. It's a safety thing. Then what we need to do is we need to be able to set the transform to the position of whatever object we've created. So we just go ahead and say transform, oops, spell that right, dot position and get. Right, so we're going to get the position of the game object, or the dot that we're hovering over and we're intersecting with. And then, we're not even hovering over, right? Our circle is essentially, the edge of our circle is touching it. And then we are going to go ahead and make this our position. Okay, let's go ahead and see if this works. All right, now it's telling me that this is problematic, so maybe well, it's giving me an error there, but this is a null check, so we're not doing anything we shouldn't be doing afterwards. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to start with this red one. I'm going to drag this over. Oh, I know what my mistake is. If I come over here, I have my layer mask set to nothing. So let's go ahead and actually set that to the grid. I'm going to stop this before I do that, just so it sticks. I'm going to go down to grid. All right, that's what we actually want to be checking for. So I'm going to go ahead and run this again. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on one of these objects and see if we can move them around. There we go. Look at that. Right now, the grid is actually on top of our objects, but that's actually fine for debugging's sake. We might need to adjust that order here in a little bit because they're all on the same layer, but you can see that I can move this one and I can move this one. Now, for some reason, I'm not quite sure why the red one isn't working. Okay, so I'm a little confused as to why the red object is not being picked up. I have not figured out where the problem is coming in, but I found that if I drag this over, and so that it is overlaid with the grid, then it works fine. And I don't know if that's because it would need to be within the bounds of this mouse pickup object that draws the grid. I honestly have no earthly idea what's going on. But as soon as I do that, right now I can click and drag this and have it snap to these different grid points. Again, really confused as to why it's not, why it wasn't working earlier. Okay, so whatever the case, it's working now. Maybe somebody in the comments or something can be like, oh, well, it's because of X, Y, or Z. And I'll keep continuing to figure out why, but that's really confusing because it was working before I did the snapping code. But as soon as I added the snapping code, it decided that it did not want to pick that up. And I just don't understand quite why. Okay. And I'm wondering if it's the layer mask is causing a problem or what the issue is. And so let's go ahead and stop this. And what we need to do now is let's go ahead and fix this weird offset thing where it starts drawing at 0, 0, 0, and let's send it over so that it can we could either start it from the bottom of the screen or we could just kind of manually scoot it over some. But if we want it to be more or less centered right around the center of the screen, what we need to do is we need to offset it basically half the number of units wide it is, right? So if it's 20, we need to offset it 10, so it starts at -10 and it goes until +10, right? So let's go ahead and make that change to our grid generator, and then we will keep going. So I'm going to go ahead and double click in here. I'm going to go ahead and hold down Option and pull it up here and go to my generate grid. And in the generate grid, what I need to do is not so much where the step size is, but where this grid size comes in, I'm going to need to divide this by 2, right? Kind of like I did with the radius for the other object. And then basically there's a couple of other steps that need to happen because I need to divide it by 2, and that will give me the last step, right? So if this was 20, then divided by 2 would be 10, which is going to give me the last, but I also need the first step. So once I've divided it by 2, what I then need to do is take that number and subtract the full size of the grid from it. So if it's 10, I need to subtract 20, so I get -10. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that, and that will give us our offset. So I'm going to go ahead and say add unit, and I'm going to type in divide, which should clean that up. I'm going to go scalar. I'm going to say 2. I'm going to take this input here. I'm going to do this division, and it looks like, right, I might need to, get rid of my group and regroup. I'm going to get rid of these 2 that say last, and I'm going to go ahead and then reconnect from the divide straight into the last. But then to do the first, I'm going to right click and I'm going to say minus. Oh, sorry, not minus, it's subtract. There we go. And it can be generic. And what I want to do is I want to take the output of this and have this be the A value, right? Because I want to say 10 minus 20, so I get a negative number. And then I want grid size to be the B value. And then I want to feed this into first here and feed this into first here. Okay, that makes it look a little bit more confusing in terms of where all these wires are going, but it should get our work done for us. So let's go ahead and double click to get out of this, and then let's go ahead and run this and see where our grid generates this time. Okay, so look at that. Now we've got this nice uniform grid here that is filling our entire page, and so now some of those issues should be fixed. There we go. Right? So now we've got our units that can snap around to all of these different grid points, right, in the scene. Now, the other thing that we might want to do is, because this grid is generating in the foreground right now, it really depends on how we want this to look, but ideally these grid points would be hidden by the objects we're aligning to them. So let's go ahead and stop this. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go down to our project pane, go to our prefabs, select our dot, open our prefab, and then we're going to want to set the order in layer here to -1, right? That means that it will, it should render below the other objects that are set to 0. So let's go ahead and just pop this back out and test this now and make sure that everything is going the direction that we want it to go. Okay, it looks like now they are indeed rendering in the back. Perfect. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our mouse pickup object, go to our flow graph, stop our graph from running, and there's just one last step we need to do, which is to encapsulate this chunk of our carry object. So I'm going to go hold down Command, I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to rename this carry object. And let's go ahead and make this some color that we haven't used yet, like a nice magenta. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit, and we can go ahead. We could. I actually like this stair step here because, right, I don't want to have those two lines between the graph sections going. But now we could actually just pull this up so we have a little bit. If I can actually click on it, so it's a little bit cleaner. We could also take all of these units in here and scoot them over a little bit and make this a little bit cleaner than we had before as well. So I can just pull this down and get everything nicely enclosed. Okay, so we have now done the lion's share of the work to generate this grid. Now, one thing you might have noticed is that a lot of the grid was hanging out over the edges of the camera. And what would be nice is if we could take the, go ahead and maybe use the W, A, S, and D keys to move the camera so that we can see other parts of the graph, because other parts of the grid, because maybe we need to, we want to make something more complex and have it be significantly larger so that it will actually go beyond the bounds of our screen. So let's go ahead and select our main camera object. Now, I've already created this graph. And so we can just go ahead and go through this really quickly. It's something that we've done several times before. So I'm going to double click. I'm going to zoom in. And I'm not going to go through this because we've done it a lot. But one thing to note is I have an object level variable called cam speed. I set the value to that to 25. And then I have this fixed update event. And that seemed to make it a lot smoother. And then I have input get access horizontal going into input get access vertical. Right? We are taking our cam speed, time delta time, multiplying those two together, and then multiplying those by the output from our axis and the output from our other axis. The horizontal axis then feeds into the x position of our transform, and we're just translating it from wherever it was to the number of units in the x direction that this little formula tells us to do. And the same goes for the y, right? Whatever vertical, it's just essentially what translate does is it adds or subtracts the number of units on to our current position. And that's all you need to do. So hopefully you can see this. You could pause the video and complete this graph yourself. Again, it's something we've done many, many, many times. So with this on, if I go ahead and run this, and now I could make my grid a lot larger than it is, but right now I'm just going to leave it set. So at this point, what I do is, I can use my mouse to select and move these objects. And if I need to move the grid, because say I want to do something up here, I can just press up on I can press the W key, and then I can access this, and I can come down and go off screen. And, granted, the grid is basically fills the screen as it is, and there's nothing to the left or right. This is something where we could potentially do a couple more things to make sure, you can only go to the bounds of the grid and all of that. But, I'm not too worried about setting those boundaries right now, right? We've got this working, and we're in a pretty good place. Okay. In the next tutorial, what I will likely do is show you how to actually click and draw a line from one point to the next point, etc. Okay.